Welcome to another episode of the Golden Hour. I'm Sharif Yunus here with Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, thanks for being on again.
Hey, Sharif, it's great to be here.
Kevin, we were worried you wouldn't come back this time, but you're here, so thank you,
I'm
thank you.
back.
It's
Mm.
great.
It's
Uh,
good that you're back too.
I'm happy to be back. Well, Kevin, we've been getting a lot of questions lately about how to make decisions. So thought it would be great to cover it this time. So decision making, why is this a difficult problem for people?
Yeah, and I always like to think what would make making the decision even more difficult. So if you're going to look and see how would you make it harder? I think maybe a great way of making a decision harder is you keep putting it off, right? So you keep on delaying making it. You procrastinate the decision. I think that one big issue with making decisions that makes it hard is procrastination. When we are procrastinating the decision, it turns into more of a threat. And each time you put it off, even little decisions, like what do I say in response to this email, the more you put it off, the harder it seems to get. The other thing that would make making a good decision hard is thinking that there is only one good outcome or good result. So that you think, okay, I could do this or I could do that. And as if there's one perfect decision and the other one is awful. Many times when people are most indecisive, it's because they're actually both of them are good options. And both of them are importantly good enough options. So all of this is people can turn making a decision into a big threat, by putting it off or by artificially, in a sense, raising the stakes as if there's some big threat if they make the wrong one. And I find myself in my practice often telling people these are both good options. And that takes away a lot of the pressure. And then thinking, okay, let's just work on then getting to the point where you start engaging the decision to make it. So I think there's a lot of the way we think about things that really does apply to that process.
So when you say threat, I two words immediately pop into my mind: anxiety and reframing. Are those? So it seems like people have anxiety about making the decision, and then the solution is to reframe.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so what are people really afraid of? When if they're agonizing over a decision? Now for unimportant things, it seems like they're afraid of regretting their choice. And so why would people spend minutes trying to decide what clothes to wear for the day? Or when you get to a restaurant and you look at the menu, like people can agonize over the decision, that what do I pick? As if they would potentially be consumed by enormous regret. So, in all these types of things, Daniel Gilbert at Harvard had done a really kind of fascinating study, but on regret and decisions. But the end result is people forecast having a lot of regret if they make the wrong decision. But in fact, when it comes about, they tend to be fine with it. So your anticipated regret is not accurate, in those cases. And in fact, it's giving you the perfect opportunity to practice being okay with good enough, which is a wonderful antidote to perfectionism. That to let yourself quickly make a decision about what to wear or, how to reply to that email or text message or, what to order in the restaurant. And so just try to see in the wider context how important is this decision? Is this giving me a big opportunity? And if not, then I'm just going to get used to being okay with the result and not let myself get kind of perfectionistic about it.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up the idea of putting it in the wider context, because that's really gets to the heart of what reframing is. Where if you're out to dinner with people, you don't want to agonize over all the items on the menu, because actually the reason why you're there is to spend time with the people. So putting that decision into, okay, it's actually not that important. The more important thing is that I quickly choose what I want to eat, and then I enjoy it or pretend to enjoy it so I can enjoy my time with the other people. And then when you mentioned what deciding what to wear, it brought to mind an example of was called decision minimalism, that some very famous tech entrepreneurs have practiced. Steve Jobs, notably, I guess he always wore a black turtleneck, jeans, and New Balance shoes. And then Mark Zuckerberg, I saw a video of Mark Zuckerberg's closet. He has about 200 gray t shirts that are all identical. Uh, and I think part of one of the reasons why they practice this is so they don't have to agonize over that decision of what to wear in the morning. I think paired with that too is maybe an idea that I want to get your thoughts on, of like decision fatigue. The thought that, well, they have all these important decisions to make throughout the day that are going to impact their multi-billion-dollar companies. So they want to make sure they're kind of at peak performance when they make those decisions. And they might think that the more decisions that they have to make throughout the day, for example, of what to wear, that creates a kind of decision fatigue and will make those future decisions worse. Is that a good way of thinking about it, or is that then maybe even just creating the same anxiety that you're trying to get away from by eliminating the decision in the first place?
I think you're right that in the end, there's the wrong idea there in this idea of decision fatigue. You know, that I do believe that there's you can get worn down from having to make a lot of important decisions again and again. That's one of the reasons why we want people to have, for instance, a morning routine. So that in the morning when you wake up, you're not agonizing, do I go exercise now? Or do I, you know, so it's just better that you have a plan and then you get used to following it. And those are fewer decisions to make. And I really like that idea of it. But I think that making good decisions is simply a form of work. And anything that would cause fatigue in that process is what would cause fatigue in any kind of work. So you don't want to do marathons. And you want to have your normal, sprints and breaks, and you have a good rhythm for how you work. And making decisions is simply a kind of work. It also seems to me like I saw a documentary about one tech startup where the founder paid something like $1 million for this top designer to help her design her wardrobe. And in the end, after spending a lot of effort and money in this process, decided that she would wear basically what Steve Jobs wore. So, like, well, to me, it's like if you would just see, okay, in the long run, in the big picture, in the widest context, is this an important decision to spend a lot of money and time on? No. Okay, and well, maybe there's some cases, but in general, for most people, the answer would be no. And then it's much better you get okay with making good enough decisions. I just say, if you're agonizing over every small decision, you're making life hard for yourself. It's much better to practice acceptance of outcomes without getting perfectionistic about those outcomes. But it also gets to this idea that there is a real kind of work to be done in making good decisions. And it's important that people see that that is like any other task. And the first step always is then how do you really bring order to making this decision?
So now we're getting into the question of, how do you go about making important decisions? Previously, it was, how do you not agonize over trivial decisions? But now, so you brought up this idea that that decision making is a process of work. And so one way we think about work is order, intensity, and constancy. But for decision making, you want to focus in on the order component, right?
I think that's right, because I think that that's really taking place in your mind, and you can kind of get you can view making this decision as if it's some gigantic mass, some amorphous blob, and how do I get through it? Well, you have to put order into it, I think.
Hmm.
Order makes things easier because it breaks them down into smaller steps. And so, and when you're talking about making good decisions, the first step is really gathering information. And so, like for instance, say a person is struggling with what to major in college. What kind of career path does he or she want to go down? Well, as long as that's imaginary, and it's just all these things are hypotheticals in their mind, it's really tough to make a good
Yeah.
decision. But they can narrow it down to a few choices and then think about collecting actual experiences. It could be other people, and then you talk to people in those professions. It could be reading about that, Or it could be even your own, if you have a co-op opportunity, if your university has that, or if you can do an internship or volunteer in some way, or have at least an informational interview with someone, just to have a sense of a need to make things real. And that's what work does. Work takes things that were in your head and then makes them real. And in making good decisions that are important, you want more real data. And it's always the first step, I think, of prudence is that you need just to like get the right information so you can make better decisions.
Mm.
And then the second step would be to reflect on what you know, to put things and think of, okay, for instance, when it comes to a career path or a big thing, what are the criteria you want to use for judging how important things are? That alone does a lot to make things clear. What are the most important factors? Or you're thinking of taking a new job and you think, okay, well, what for me then are the most important factors to consider while doing that? So money might be a factor, but time spent with family, time spent commuting, region of the country, you have to prioritize. And that also makes it real. So that now you're actually dealing with things that can help you to make the decision.
Okay, so we have the first two steps here to make it real, gather information, and then list out what your priorities are. And then at some point, okay, so now we'll have a list of options. Say it's a list of careers or a list of majors or a list of colleges, and we have the associated kind of priorities there. And then now, so that's basically laying out everything we know about it. And then the last step, then you just have to decide.
Exactly. Yep. So the last step is then you come up with a decision. And for that, you might need to have a deadline for yourself. It even helps your default attention in the background to process things to have a deadline. That's an important part of working something is you get your you apply your task attention to the question, but you also then need time to let your default mode work on it. And but a deadline helps a lot there. You say, okay, I'm gonna, and then that way, as the deadline is approaching, part of you is going to be sifting through, and you're going to start to get a gut feeling. And often that gut feeling is a good indicator, partly because it seems to correspond more to the right half of your brain. That the left half of the brain can get snagged by particular a way of thinking about this or about certain outcomes. The right tends to take in the whole a lot more. And so with and that often shows itself in having a gut feeling. So it's good to give that time to settle, but a deadline then makes it really help. So I think if you can gather the information, reflect on your priorities, and then set a deadline to make the decision, you'll end up having a very good process for making these important life decisions. And taking it from just some imaginary hypothetical consideration now down to something that is very real.
When I was making decisions about, for example, what job to pursue, what kind of career, I often found it helpful to kind of commit in my mind to something. Maybe it was like my current top choice, and then to talk to people about it and explain to them, okay, I'm really strongly considering this. And they would say, okay, why is that? And then I would kind of explain it to them, and that would help. I think it would just help me to just kind of get into the mindset of of doing that. So in some way, it made it a little bit more real. But then I think also having to explain my decision to someone forced me to get clear about what my underlying motives like really were. And if I said something and it didn't really come out right, it was probably I was just getting just my head was getting messed up about something. So I don't know how that fits in.
I think what you're doing there is essentially you're circling back and repeating those steps of the work so that you're thinking now of, okay, how do I gather more data? And you're going to present this one decision, yes or no, to the people. And then the second step would be, again, reflect on what you know. And for that, psychology has a very good tool. It's called the four square. Okay, so the way it works, and it's a powerful way when you've gotten it down to like essentially one decision that now you're testing. Best way of doing that that we know of in psychology is so it could be taking this job at Google, let's say. Do I take it or not? Okay, then you list out all the pros of taking it. And then another square to the right, you list out all the cons of taking it. And then in the lower left quadrant, you list out all the pros of not taking it, staying at your job. And then to the right, all the cons of not taking it. Now, when you actually go through those step by step, you're going to see that the pros of taking the Google job and the cons of not taking it agree with each other, but they're not the same. So it's important to actually do them as two separate things. And similarly, the cons of taking it and the pros of not taking it are going to touch on a lot of the same types of things, but from a different angle. So what you experience as you do that is that in the end, if you're having trouble making this decision, it usually is because one decision seems more rewarding in the short term, and one decision seems better in the long term. And you don't really see that until you lay out all the factors. And then they tend to group. So I know it could be for taking the job at Google, that I don't know, what would you say would be the pros of taking that job?
Yeah, it could be a great challenge. They're a very rigorous, uh, if I don't know if suppose it's engineering, they're some of the best engineers in the world, so it's going to help you become a better engineer. They also pay very well and have really good health insurance and a lot of perks.
And then it could be that the cons of taking it would be things like it's going to be a whole new environment to get used to, and you aren't sure if you're going to get along with your new boss. So those would be things that would make it. Well, just taking that frame on its own, you would see that a lot of the pros there in taking it are actually long-term benefits. That this is an area that you want to develop in, and this is exactly the kind of challenge you need. And the cons in that case tended to be more short term, that the awkwardness of the transition and some of the unknowns. But those are all going to be short term. Now, this is different. This can't be used in general to say should people take jobs at Google. But a given person doing this will find that he or she will tend, if they're having trouble making a decision, that it's because they haven't really sorted out long term and short term.
So, do you think it would be helpful to go through the rest of those, the pros of staying and the cons of staying?
Yeah. So if you're going to go through the pros of staying, it might be things like you already are comfortable with the boss, and the uh, so it would be, and then the cons, of not staying is that you miss an opportunity to develop professionally. You miss an opportunity to develop this skill, and so you see again, that there's going to be long term and short term. Now, again, this is just all kind of hypothetical where I'm volunteering the things. But in any important decision, you can separate if it comes down to like a yes or no. Should I do, take should we make the move or not make the move? Should we buy the new house or not buy this new house or not? Once you've gotten it down to a binary, you have this very powerful tool of the Foursquare that helps you then think through more all the pros, all the cons either way. And it's just very interesting that when we actually do this with people, that you see the short and long term tend to just group together in different quadrants. Another thing that it allows you to do is ask yourself, so the examples, sometimes I use is if a person is saying, do I they're having trouble in someone they're dating, they're like, do I break up or not? And one of the cons they say of breaking up is I'll never find anyone else again. Right. So well, writing these things out, you can also ask yourself, is it real? Do you actually know that this is the case? Because a lot of imaginary factors sometimes get brought into it, but writing it down, once you start writing down, I'll never find anyone else again. It's pretty clear that, okay, that it was a factor in your mind, but when you write it down, you can see this actually isn't a real concern. So there's something about writing things down that helps you assess, is it real or not? And again, the stats doesn't have to be done for every decision, and if you're using it for unimportant decisions, then it's probably perfectionism or even procrastinating making it. But for really big things, it's a powerful lens. And then, but in the end, you still may need a deadline then for actually making it because the last step is always that active command. And these, by the way, are just simply the three parts of prudence. So that the classical virtue theory, the first step is counsel and is gathering information. The second step is reflection. And there's different tools you can use to reflect on what you know, and writing it down is a great one. And then the third is the active command. And there, setting a deadline to make it is really helpful.
Okay, now, Kevin, turning back to the example of taking the job at Google, I mean, suppose you have one of the pros is making more money of taking the job, whereas one of the cons is maybe you'll have less time for family. So it seems like, okay, now you've put order into it. You pretty well understand the different factors involved and which ones are real. But how do you then balance those different factors? It seems like there's something more needed to really make that decision.
Yeah, that's a great point. So in a way, the first question when you're thinking about making a decision that's hard is this actually an important one or not? And then the second question is, making it real so that you can actually see the different factors. But the third is making it meaningful. So what does it take to make the best kind of choice? And there it comes down to, is are you prioritizing as an end something that's really a means, that's just some outcome, versus really looking at what is the most meaningful end for you to be serving. And that gets so it's essentially outcomes versus ideals. So you can be making decisions in life with the aspiration to love and serve others, and then whatever allows you to love them, in better ways, in deeper ways, and to serve people, in a greater way. The greater service, the greater love has to lead to the best decisions. I think that's really the virtue of sincerity. Is being honest with yourself and sincere. Like, what am I prioritizing here? And what is the end that I'm really saying is my number one end? But we never go wrong when you're bringing ideals into it and thinking, the deepest things, the most meaningful values that I have, okay, how can they guide me in making this decision? Because there's always going to be enticing particular outcomes. And so it might be that, living in Northern California seems really appealing to you. But that would mean, say, moving away from all your extended family and not seeing them. And, so those are actually, I think, super important considerations, in making. So one that you could say that the deepest analysis, is the benefits that I'm looking for here. Am I seeing them in terms of just particular outcomes, or actually do they resonate with my highest ideals and the greatest service I can provide to others?
That's great. Yeah, and I mean, one piece of advice this whole analysis reminded me of is that if you have two possibilities, choose the more difficult one. What do you think of that piece of advice, Kevin?
Well, what that advice gets you to do is to embrace the short-term pain for the sake of a long-term gain. So, and often the decisions that we find hard are because in the short term, they actually are going to involve a steeper learning curve in some way. It could be in a skill, it could be in a virtue, but there's some steeper learning curve. But that in the long run, that really does pay off. But if you're making decisions for short term comfort, it's going to end up in the long term not being as good for you. So I think really that built into that advice, which properly understood is good, is essentially saying have high ideals, have kind of wide horizons for growth and for service. Now, that might mean in the short run, you have to make you have to do a lot of learning, and you have to make some decisions that seem hard, but that does ultimately pay off in the most meaningful ways. Because really what we want are decisions that are in the long run deeply meaningful. You'll never regret or blame yourself for a decision that you made based on the long term. If you had done your work and you had thought through the alternatives, you said, okay, in the short run, this is going to be harder, but in the long run, it's going to pay off. Well, in the long run, you're going to be happier. And even in the short run, you will be. But if you keep putting off the decision, it gets harder and harder. Or if you're a perfectionist about an outcome, That's all actually short term thinking. And then it gets much more difficult.
Great. Well, hey, Kevin, thanks so much. We're actually out of time at this point, but I think we've covered the main points. I don't know if you want to add a final point or briefly summarize the this approach to this decision making, but I'll give you the final
Well, I
word.
think maybe just to say that if you start with where we ended, which is the ideal that this serves or how it allows you to serve others, I think it makes the entire process much more real and much less daunting. If you ask yourself, okay, what ideal am I living, as I'm choosing to what to wear in the morning? Well, maybe it's just like learning how to not prioritize that. And so you're just able to make those decisions. The ideals actually guide you at every step of the way. So the more you can let like any kind of work, the more you can bring higher ideals into that work itself and let them guide the process, you're sure it's going to work out better in the long run.
I really like that. Next big decision I
Great.
make, I'm on it. Okay. Well,
You and me
Kevin,
both.
great. Thanks so much, Kevin, for joining us again, and we will be back next week.
Thanks, Sharif.